So welcome to this, the fifth and final plenary session of the 2016 American Academy of Religion annual meeting. Tonight we have the rare and amazing privilege to hear from perhaps the most powerful moral voice in our country at this time, who is traveling now from city to city, calling for a moral revolution of values. And tonight, we're going to hear the Reverend Dr. William Barber talk to us about, building on the theme of this gathering, Revolutionary Love, the revolution of love. So it is a great honor to have him here, and let's get started. So I am very honored and pleased to introduce to you Professor Julia Watts-Belser, who works in Jewish studies with a focus on Talmud, rabbinic literature, and Jewish ethics. She is a rabbi. Her research brings ancient texts into conversation with disability studies, queer theory, feminist thought, and environmental ethics, and focuses on classical Jewish responses to drought and disaster, portrayals of sexual violence in rabbinic responses to enslavement and empire, as well as gender, disability, and the dissident body of late antiquity. She writes queer feminist Jewish theology and brings disabilities culture into the conversation with Jewish tradition. Before joining the theology department at Georgetown, Professor Belser held a research fellowship in women's studies and religion at Harvard Divinity School and taught in the religious studies department at Missouri State University. She serves on the board of the Society for Jewish Ethics and holds leadership positions in the American Academy of Religion. She is also a board member of NAACP, a national community of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Jews and allies. So Julia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Serene, so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to be here tonight. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, who is among the most eloquent and urgent moral voices of our time. He is the president of the North Carolina NAACP, the pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and the architect of the Forward Together moral movement, whose Moral Monday protests have brought together advocates for racial justice, environmental justice, feminist, LGBTQ and queer liberation, disability justice, prison reform, and poor and working class activists to forge a powerful, broad-based, progressive political movement that has successfully challenged voter disenfranchisement, the evisceration of Medicaid and unemployment benefits, and regressive legislation targeting working class and poor families. I dare say we need him now more than ever before. He is a brilliant strategist at the center of a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-issue movement, a man who has been called one of the most gifted organizers and orators in the country today. Reverend Dr. Barber delivered an electrifying keynote at the 2016 Democratic National Convention in which he called a rapt crowd to be the moral defibrillators of our time, to revive the moral heart of our democracy, to shock this nation with the power of love. He is the visiting professor of public theology and activism at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York and a senior fellow at Auburn Seminary. He is the author of several books, most recently The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and The Rise of a New Justice Movement, published by Beacon Press. Reverend Dr. Barber comes from a long line of activists. He was born 2 days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington to parents on the front lines of desegregating North Carolina schools. His life and his work are steeped in moral conviction, the deep moral clarity that we must work together on behalf of human dignity and decency, that hate and violence may rage in the streets and in the halls of power, but love will always overcome. Please join me, friends, in welcoming Reverend Dr. William Barber.
It's not just bad policy, it's against the common good. My friends, economic sustainability, living wages is a moral issue. Education is a moral issue. Healthcare is a moral issue. The environment is a moral issue. Addressing the disparities in our criminal justice system that impact black, brown, and poor white people is a moral issue. Protecting and expanding voting rights and immigrant rights and LGBTQ rights and women's rights and Native Americans and labor issues, those are moral issues. It's not a liberal position or a conservative position. It's immoral to sing God shed his grace on us and then refuse to shed grace on immigrants and Muslims and people who are gay. It's just wrong. And what we need to be asking of all of our leaders when all of these policies is not, is it the left position or the right position, but is it constitutionally consistent? Is it morally defensible? And is it economically sane? Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but Teddy Roosevelt wanted universal health care. Teddy Roosevelt wanted a minimum wage. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to protect the environment. Teddy Roosevelt supported public education. Teddy Roosevelt said we need to get our money out of politics. Teddy Roosevelt supported raising the minimum wage. What we have in this country is extremism that has hijacked parties. We have a heart problem. That's why we're moving across the country. Because way down in our hearts, we still believe that justice is right. Down in our hearts, we still believe that right can be actualized, justice can be mobilized, and meanness can be neutralized. We need a movement that refuses to accept going backwards. And I'm here to tell you, the reason we got Baptists in here, and Methodists in here, and Jews in here, and Muslims in here, and folk that just believe in a moral universe is because that God or the Spirit, however you want to say it, decided that in this season he needed some social and moral defibrillators. We must shock this nation with the power of love. We must shock this nation with the power of mercy. We must shock this nation and fight for justice for all. We can't give up on the heart of our democracy, not now, not ever. Is there a heart in the house tonight? Is there a heart in the house tonight? Is there a heart in Boston tonight? Is there a heart in America tonight? Moral dissenters must stand up again today, not just in our sanctuaries of safety, but we must carry the sanctuary into the public square. Hallelujah! God the glory, revive us again.
I know justice is coming soon, but we got to hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Oh, hold on just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon, and we got to fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little little while longer. Whoa, fight on. Just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon, and we've got to love on. Just a little while longer. Love on. Just a little while longer. We've got to love on. Just a little while longer. I know justice is coming soon.
Amen. Amen. God, we thank you for the endurance of love and justice, no matter how beaten and how battered. Keep us hopeful, keep us faithful, surprise us again, Lord, because we know whenever you call men and women to say anything in your name, you take the risk of putting treasure in frail, faulty, sometimes failing vessels, but you do it that the excellency of the power might be of thee and not of us. Hide us, hold us, and help us. Surprise us. In your name we pray. Amen. It's good to be here today. Give it up for Miss Yara Allen, who is a theomusicologist with Repairers of the Breach and visiting artist in resident at Auburn, and she's available to come to your seminaries and to teach on theomusicology, something that was first lifted by our colleague John Spencer, and to help teach churches and seminarians and others. So we certainly hope you will invite her to come. Thank you, Rabbi, for such a gracious invitation and a gracious introduction. I can say this now to Serene Jones, my president, and yours, outgoing, who is the president of Union and past president of AAR, and now Dr. Eddie Glaude. It seems like I just keep getting hooked up with them, who's your incoming president. And so I'm so thankful to all of you. And today, the godfather of my children, Dr. Willie Jennings, who just came to Yale, is here in the room, and I'm so glad to be with you on today, particularly representing now, I want people to know about Repairers of the Breach, which is the group the organization we founded to work with others in repairing these breaches that race and class have called and calling for this moral revolution. And so they claim that I'm the senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, so let me try, and then you all can grade me later. You know, in the midst of so much hate, I've really been wrestling with this commandment that I've been instructed by this guy I follow to keep. A new command I give to you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, so also must you love one another, and by this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. We gather at a critical moment in the American story. 2 weeks ago on election night, I felt a great sadness for America, not a Democratic sadness, not a Republican sadness. I'm actually a registered independent, but a sadness for the very heart and the soul of our nation. On January 20th, 2017, we will bid farewell to the first African-American president, and who was by no means some radical that people. In many ways, a very conventional president, but a man of integrity who pulled us out of recession, attempted to give health care to millions, and I believe tried to do things right within the system that we have. And on that day, we will bid him farewell, and then we will witness the inauguration of a Khan who did little to spurn the endorsement by forces of xenophobia and white supremacy. And it is impossible to react to this moment with anything less than revulsion and profound anxiety. Trump represents something more than an individual. He represents vulgarity unbounded. And his election strikes fear into the hearts of the vulnerable, the weak, and above all, the many varieties of others whom he has so deeply insulted. The African-American other, the Hispanic other, the female other, the Jewish other, the Muslim other. Trump ran his campaign sensing the feeling of dispossession and anxiety among millions of voters, white voters in the main, and many of those voters, not all, but many followed Trump because they saw that this slick performer, once a relative cipher when it came to politics, was more than willing to assume their resentments, their fury, their sense of a new world that conspired against their interests, in which even after all of his insults of women, 62% of white women supported him. He articulated their fears rooted in racism and classism. Didn't offer any answers, but merely said, "You're right to be afraid, very afraid." And that Obama represents the boogeyman of a coming diversity that will undo the world you grew up knowing, and I alone can save you. And you have one more chance before 2020 when the diversity becomes almost overwhelming. Some of you, like me, when you saw the results come in, you said what Jesus said to that fig tree that represent the failing nation of Israel. Damn. But while we do indeed face a dire situation, this is not new.
That's right.
Trumpism is as an American as apple pie. Van Jones had it right when he said, we tell our children, don't be bullies, don't be racist, but then we have an election like this. But this is as American as apple pie, and American history has been met time and time again with the same backlash. In fact, Jesus himself met such a backlash. After his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, this is the context of the new commandment that is recorded in John's gospel. This brown-skinned Palestinian Jew had built a movement from the ground up, from Bethlehem up, from Galilee up, from the ghetto up, from Nazareth up. He went around starting free clinics everywhere he went. He never charged a leper a copay. Everywhere he went, he was challenging the empire's greed. He was sowing revolutionary love. When he got to Jerusalem, he met a backlash. He met some religious folk who wanted to make Israel great again. He met some Pharisees who were determined to walk away from everything the Torah had taught them about caring for the poor, if they could somehow conspire with the powers that be to simply have a place. He met a democratic election before Pontius Pilate that chose Barabbas for freedom and sent him to the cross. Jesus was born in a time of tyranny pushed by strong men like Herod and Caesar, who loved to sow fear, division. He was born in a time of great economic stratification between the honored ones and the humiliators, or the humiliated ones. He was born in a time when the 99% ruled over the 1%, and strong men would kill babies to try to stop political competition. Strong men would force pregnant women to cross the desert to pay taxes while the wealthy flaunted their wealth and privilege. A time when crucifixion was not just anybody's death, but the fate for political dissident. A time when Jesus was profiled as a threat, a terrorist. Jesus was known for bringing people together across racial lines, class lines. He was known for challenging the economics of the empire with the politics of the gospel of love, and placing the poor at the center of God's attention and demanding that they be at the center of the nation's attention. But the empire had her false prophets, as all empires do. They plotted against Jesus, daring to preach revolutionary love, connecting justice and nonviolence as the only way to ultimately challenge the reactionary and incendiary politics of hate. And it was in that context that he still said, by this love, all men will know that you're my disciples. After death and resurrection, one of his disciples picked it up in another time when a strong man, Nero, was declaring the same things in more violent ways either than Caesar or Herod. But following his teacher's teaching, he said, how can you say you love God and not love your brother? And then he said, even in the midst of all this hate, it is perfect love that casts out fear. In this American context, this pattern is not new, this hate, this pitting folk against one another, and we would do well to pay attention to it. I was reading a book some years ago, and then I heard Dr. Rick Lisher preach about Dr. King, and he said something that has stuck with me all these years. Dr. King, he said, didn't get in trouble for preaching love, he got in trouble for preaching it in all the wrong places. For moving it beyond the normalcy. You love your brother that's born from the same mother, to talking about how does this budget reflect love? How do these segregation laws reflect or line up with the love of Christ? And if my brother Cornel West is right, that justice is what love looks like in public, then the public square can be a dangerous place to preach love in times like these, but we must. America has a name for facing the love question in our public life. We faced it in the shadow of slavery and amid the wreckage of the Civil War. And the name that America calls this trying to wrestle with love in the public square is reconstruction. African Americans in the first Reconstruction joined hands with whites in the North and in the South who were willing to see one another as allies. They were wrestling with love in the public square. And within 4 years after the end of the Civil War, white and black alliances controlled every state house in the South. Together, in the 1800s, they elected new leaders, some white, many of them African Americans and former slaves. Almost all the state legislatures were controlled by either a predominantly black alliance or a strong interracial fusion coalition. Within that context, working out love in the public square, they hammered out new constitutions from a deeply moral perspective. Last December 6th was the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment, worked out in this context. Then they had the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal rights, worked out in this context. Then the 15th Amendment, protecting the right to vote, worked out in this context. And upon these, later on, we get the 19th Amendment, where Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, white and black, come together, working out love in the public square. These fusion coalitions, these revolutionary love coalitions 150 years ago built the first public schools for all people. In fact, they were so bold with this love that they wrote public education as a constitutional right in southern state constitutions, a right that is not even to this day in the federal Constitution. They gave all persons, not just children, the right to public education. In the state Constitution of North Carolina, they even said that beneficent provision to the poor and the orphan and the widow is the first duty of a civilized and Christian state. That was put in the Constitution by two clergy, one of them named J.W. Hood, who became the president of Livingstone College and the bishop of the AME Zion Church, and a white congregationalist named Samuel Ashley. They included labor rights in those constitutions as they worked out love in the public square. Listen at the preamble of the Constitution put together when preachers came together and said, what does this love of Christ have to do with public square? This is what they wrote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor and the pursuit of happiness. Now, you picked that up from Thomas Jefferson, but they wrote it into the Constitution, added it and tweaked it to the fruit of your own labor, because they took seriously what Jesus had said about caring for the poor and what Isaiah 58 said about loosing the wicked bands of wickedness, which literally means in translation, pay people what they deserve. They took it seriously, and they wrote it into the body politic. because they knew in labor without living wages in it is nothing but a pseudo form of slavery. Yeah. And they did this before the Knights of Labor ever came to the South and then left. Black and white together, they formed these moral fusion coalitions. They expanded access to the ballot. They wrote new fairness into the criminal justice system. This, my brothers, is what love looked like in the public square in the South in 1866, 67, 68, 69, 1870. But in 4 years, the experiment of the first Reconstruction, this powerful model for revolutionary love, faced powerful and immoral opposition of hate and deconstruction. And we must understand that opposition then to understand America right now. Many former Confederates saw black citizenship and interracial alliances, fusion coalitions as inherently illegitimate. They hated them. They organized the Ku Klux Klan first, not to mess with black people, but to terrorize white people that would dare work with black people, that would dare build loving relationships, whom they saw as race traitors. Then they attacked black leaders. And then they began with their hate to wail against taxes. They said, we got to cut taxes, because they saw if the government had the right amount of taxes, they could begin to make up some of the damage that had been done through disenfranchisement. So they cried about cutting taxes as an end to the first Reconstruction by keeping state governments unable to feel the promises of the post-slavery economy and to lift up the former slave. They wanted to keep the Fusion Love Coalition from expanding opportunity and enlarging the democracy and supporting public education. They could not outright deny, but they decided to abridge the 15th Amendment. They worked to overtake the courts, the Trump campaign, wrong century. Sometimes this stuff gets blurred in my head. The enemies of the first Reconstruction slowly took over the courts. They said to people, you better support us so we can deal with these courts. In 1883, they nullified the Civil Rights Act of 1875. How did they do it? 1877, there was an election or a selection. Rutherford B. Hayes loses the popular vote, does not win the electoral vote. They call him in, cut a deal. Will you give us the South? Will you pull the troops out of the South? Will you deconstruct? Will you divide all of this fusion working together? Yes, I will. Then you can be president, Mr. Hayes. And less than 6 years later, they had taken over the Supreme Court, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was overturned in 1883 with one lone dissenter, Justice Harlan out of Kentucky, who in his dissent brought up love in the Bible, brought up what God said about all human beings. Listen now. Listen to the ancient war cry of the deconstruction movement. First of all, the ones that wanted to roll back voting rights and take away criminal justice reform and undo equal protection under the law. They said then, our goal is to take back America. Our goal is to redeem America. Now look at the word redeem. They used moral messages for immoral activity. They called themselves the redemption movement, but redemption there meant to redeem America from all of this interracial fusion coalition that had gone on in the first Reconstruction. The politics of agape love and Reconstruction were met by a backlash of hate and fear. What Jesus experienced in first century Palestine, black and white preachers who worked together in the first Reconstruction faced in the 19th century. And we need to know that, because this stuff is in the very soul of America. And not only did they overturn the Civil Rights Act of 1875, by 1896, you had Plessy versus Ferguson that said separate but equal was okay. And in fact, it followed the mandates of God according to the misguided teachings of racism, racist theology. And then in 1898, on November the 10th, in Wilmington, North Carolina, you had the worst coup d'etat ever of that age, where black and whites were run out of town, and a Gatling gun was brought into Wilmington, and nearly 3% of the city was killed. More people were killed on November the 10th, 1898 than were killed on September the 11th in New York. And for a long time, it wasn't even in the history book. And preachers preached the Sunday before November the 10th if we must fill the rivers of the Cape Fear River with the blood of the Negro, let it be so that we return the government to the proper hands of the white man. And then in 1915, 100 years ago, that's why Dr. King said that. 100 years ago, he was reflecting on all this stuff. But 100 years ago today, Woodrow Wilson, a very educated president of Princeton University, that's why you got to understand education can't necessarily save you from racism and classism and militarism. Woodrow Wilson was very well educated, but when he got into the Oval Office, he said, I want to show a sign that the Reconstruction is truly open. By this time, every black in the Congress had been removed. All the voting rights had been rolled back. But he decides to bring a media nuance, a racist media nuance. You know, the first time you could hear a film, you'd move beyond silent film, and he plays it in the Oval Office. G.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which, by the way, was written by a man from Shelby, North Carolina, in Cleveland County, North Carolina, which is the place where Dalen Roof ran to after he had killed 9 people in Mother Emanuel. And 100 years later, after Woodrow Wilson played this media nuance, racist media nuance, Birth of a Nation, 100 years later, alt-right is now in the Oval Office. But then there's the second Reconstruction. Decades following World War II saw the rise of a second Reconstruction. Blacks, whites, Latinos, young people came together, willing to march, willing to suffer. They built a new fusion movement. They tried this love in the public square again with the moral underpinnings of leaders like Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel. They spoke of the urgency, moral urgency of now, and the language in the street began to match some of the language in the pulpits and in the synagogues and in the mosque. From their jail cells, they changed the language in the halls of power. Presidents and senators and legislators and governors and editors and poets all began to write and talk with moral urgency. The language changed, and they had to change. They began to quote Langston Hughes, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that has never been yet and must be. America has never been America to me, but I swear this oath, America will be." And with the second revolution, Reconstruction, this experiment with revolutionary love in the public square, this agape, we got desegregation, or at least a move toward desegregation of public schools, Medicaid, Medicare, expansion of Social Security so that finally women and black people couldn't be included since they were first written out in 1935. We got economic opportunity, the War on Poverty, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, an increase in the minimum wage. Fusion politics began to gain tremendous ground. The second Reconstruction required, though, a blood sacrifice, as love always does. Whites, blacks, Jews, Christians, and others fighting against Jim Crow in order to pass the Civil Rights Act of '64. 2 years later, after Bloody Sunday in Selma, we passed not 2 years later, but after several months after Bloody Sunday, we passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 2 years after the March on Washington. 4 girls are blown up in a Birmingham church, not during the Birmingham movement, but after we were successful in the spring of 1963. Hate blew them up in anger of success. And then Mike Mansfield, a Democrat, and Everett Dirksen, a Republican, come together. And they say some things are bigger than Republican and Democrat. And they put forth the Voting Rights Act. And the language is clear. It only reinforces the provision that we thought we'd already won in the 15th Amendment in 1870. But this bill increased African-American voting participation and made it possible for African-Americans and whites to begin to build coalitions once again. Once again, during the second Reconstruction, there came a moral commitment to lift the poor through the politics of love. Head Start, K-12 funding, Pell Grants, higher education. Anybody know about any of that stuff to get your degrees? That all came out of this Reconstruction revolutionary love. All these programs began to enjoy public support. The War on Poverty had 3 parts. First, boost wages through education and job training. The second part, provide income support, particularly for single mothers. And the third part was to create a system of government health care. But there's a fourth part we often don't talk about, and that is that the War on Poverty was connected to the Civil Rights Movement. So if your hospital segregated, you couldn't get federal dollars. Which actually ended up giving many white, poor whites better health care and better education. But go back and read the speeches of Kennedy and Johnson and how they talked about civil rights, voting rights, the war on poverty, and they used the word poor. They talked about moral issues, not just partisan issues, not left and right. In 1960, before the war on poverty, more than a third of American senior citizens lived in gut-wrenching poverty, and 30% of our kids by 1975, even with all the attempts to undermine the war on poverty, child poverty had been cut in half, and poverty among seniors was reduced to 60%. Just before his assassination, however, Dr. King brought the moral visions of the civil rights movement and the war on poverty together in his 1968 Poor People's Campaign. And in one of his last speeches, King said, there's a profound schizophrenia in America. There are two Americas. One beautiful, where millions drink the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality, but then there's this other America, a country of grinding poverty that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. And he used that as a moral framework for announcing the Poor People's Campaign. He called for a Marshall Plan that would build up Appalachia and the urban cities for poor Negroes and poor white people. He said that was the only way we could move forward. And he called for the Revolutionary Love Nonviolent Act of going to D.C. and taking over federal buildings and refusing to move. In fact, the sermon that he texted his mother, the one that he was going to preach, the last sermon, was literally entitled, America Will Go to Hell if she does not deal with this issue of race and class and have a mighty Poor People's Campaign. And boy, did the extremists revolt against the second Reconstruction. In fact, it wasn't just the extremists. You know, after Dr. King preached at Riverside, 150 newspapers wrote against him. The NAACP came out against him. The unions came out against him. And Johnson withdrew his standing invitation to the White House simply because he said there are three great evils, racism, materialism, and militarism, and that until we dealt with them, our silence was actually betrayal. The politics of love was met with backlash, hate and fear, violence and terror. Swanner, Chain, and Goodman, Follow the Girls. But then they launched the Southern Strategy. And guess what the mantra of the Southern Strategy was? We must take back our country again. We must make it great again. Once again, that became the language of the enemies of Reconstruction, love in the public square. The progress, once popular, became racialized. Programs that were benefiting black and white people were suddenly racialized. Backlash, entrenchment, attacking black leaders, tax cuts, take away the tax base, attacks on school integrations, and instead, and draining public education dollars into private segregated schools. The electoral attacks were developed by Kevin Phillips, who later repented some, but at that time he was a Nixon campaign aide and Republican strategist. He called the Southern Strategy the secret to American politics. Listen to what he said in his book, is to know who hates who, and you play in that hate. He said the Southern Strategy was designed to persuade Southern whites to leave the Democratic Party, follow Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms out of their opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. Nixon found out who hated who and decided to use us. They, in fact, in a revealing interview, all of us can Google, you may already have, Republican strategist Lee Atwater described how it works. This is what he said. You start out in 1954 and you say, nigga, 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 if you want to win, particularly out in the South. But in 1968, you can't say that anymore. It'll hurt you, it'll backfire you. So you start saying code words for nigga, like forced busing, states' rights. Then you get real abstract and you talk about tax cuts and entitlement reform. And these things sound totally economic. And you fool people to think that the real issue is just economics. But the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and whites blame their problem on blacks, and whites end up still suffering. But they have a boogeyman. And Atwater would end up managing George Herbert Walker Bush's successful run for the president in 1988, deploying the Willie Horton ad and using frightening images of a black rapist to create divide. He then became the national GOP chair And he said the target of the Southern strategy was to develop a solid South where the majority of Southern whites would resist and repeal any fusion political alliance, any of this working out stuff in the public square, bringing folk together. We have to have a politics that keeps people divided, particularly African Americans and whites. And if we do that, we can control 181 electoral votes before the campaign ever starts. Atwater acknowledged that the Southern strategy originated with the campaigns of George Wallace and Barry Goldwater. George Wallace didn't win, but people call George Wallace the greatest loser of all time because he showed how to use the language of anti-elitism, anti-communism, and racial code words to inflame white voters, reeling with fear, economic fear, and hatred of the Black freedom movement, the anti-war movement, the counterculture movement, the women's liberation movement. Nick Wallace lost, but Richard Nixon learned how to out-Wallace Wallace. And for a footnote, if you think Donald Trump's campaign rhetoric was unprecedented, just Google George Wallace's 1968 Madison Square Garden speech. Not what he spoke in the South, but what he spoke at Madison Square Garden in 1968, and that speech almost reads verbatim like Trump's stump speeches. Strategist Kevin Phillips convinced Nixon that not only if we do this can we get 181 electoral votes locked up and 13 governors and 26 members of the United States Senate and 31% of the House of Representatives. If we do this right, we can also get the so-called white ethnics in the North who were ripe for picking if we could create enough hate. And even Democrats in New York would turn Republican because they didn't like the Jews and the Negroes who run New York. The South would become the base of the Southern strategy, but then it would be used around the country, especially in the suburbs and in the Rust Belt. And who finally capitalizes on this? Charles Koch. 1963, according to an article in the New York Times, he had a meeting and said, we're not going to invest anymore in Messiah candidates. We're going to invest in building a movement from the ground up. We're going to take this strategy, work to take over the courts, work to build think tanks, work to change the narrative, work to build media groups. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan used this strategy to the fullest. He had become the governor using hate, attacking the University of California at Berkeley, Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers. He had become the champion of the movement to repeal the 1964 Rumford Act that prevented property owners from refusing to rent or sell property on the basis of race and religion. That's how he got his start. When he got to the 1980 Republican presidential nomination, where did his staff choose to open his campaign? Philadelphia, Mississippi, known for one thing. It was the place where the civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Swarner, met the hate of the South, the hate of reactionism. They had been murdered. He gave a speech, and guess what he said? We got to take our country back. Stirred up white hate. He called the Civil Rights Act of '64 bad legislation. He said the Voting Rights Act was a humiliation to the South. He said we need to cut taxes. He told the tales of welfare queens who drove fleets of Cadillacs purchased with food stamps, and he claimed to have been in a grocery store line beside a strapping young buck with a fistful of food stamps and a stack of porterhouse steaks. And using the language of the Southern strategy, he won a landslide in the South, even though his policies ended up hurting many of the people that voted for him, particularly white. And the second Reconstruction, for all intents and purposes, was over. Now, I know a lot of you all are professors. And maybe you'll forgive me, maybe you won't, for dwelling on the backstory. But the problem is in this country, and you all know it well, the worst thing you can do is an attempt to exegete a scripture without understanding the zits and Laban. And the worst thing we can do right now is try to exegete America without understanding her past and present zits and Laban. And too often we gloss over this history. Right now, progressives are making a dangerous mistake trying to make this just about economic rage. Right now. My good friend Bernie is making that mistake. I've seen others that are gone out and they're making that mistake. They're trying to find one silver bullet because they do not want to deal ultimately with the fact that racism and classism is the kind of ancestral relationship within this American context that you can never deal with one without dealing with the other. And so we're shocked, you say, by Donald Trump. We can't make sense of what happened. We're surprised. Well, if you know this history, the only thing you may be surprised by is how easily he was able to use these tactics in the 21st century. And so, really, America right now faces something bigger than Trump or Clinton. The question is a moral question. Whether we're going to have a revolution of love or whether we're going to be guided by the reactionary activities of hate. And the good news inside of all that bad news I just read is alongside this sad tale about America, reconstruction, deconstruction, lies a living hermeneutic for how we can possibly implement John 13 and how we can love one another. We must begin to think in terms of a third reconstruction, a third moral reconstruction, rooted in the greatest anchors of love and justice. And just maybe you've been born for such a time as this. I believe the turmoil we're witnessing around the country, in fact, is the birth pains of the third reconstruction. Tomorrow Monday, Black Lives Matter, environment, the birth pain. In fact, it may be more than the birth pain. It may be in the adolescent stages. And like Herod, the strong men want to kill it because they see it coming and really can't stop it. Do you know that if you just register 30% of the unregistered black voters in the South, and you could get them to work in a little revolutionary love with whites and Latinos, the Southern strategy is over. Not 100 years from now, right now. If we build movements, the South is no longer South. We saw it breaking. We saw holes come in the wall when President Obama broke through in 2000. It wasn't really about President Obama. It was about this fusion coalition that expanded the electorate. Black people, white people, Republicans, Democrats, gay, straight, all coming together was the first sign of an idea whose time to come. And I'm a witness that when Obama broke through in North Carolina, my God, we saw all kind of white lash and hate lash that America's reeling from right now. And it's because sometimes, as Walter Wink once said, you need to understand a blessing of an enemy. And that is that sometimes your enemy actually is telling you how strong you are. Yeah, some of you may have heard Dave Chappelle's reflection after visiting the new National Museum of African American History in D.C. He said, powerful exhibits, chains that we were once shackled in that brought us all the way to America. He said, but you go up every floor and you go up, things get a little better, And by the time he got to the top floor, he said, I was on cloud 9. He said, but then I hit the door marked North Carolina and fell all the way to the basement. But the point of this is, you know, my point is, since prophets are always regionalized, you know, God don't let you be everywhere. You Amos and Tekoa, you know. I'm coming here from North Carolina to say a word for the nation. If you're still in shock over Trump's win, let me say with Brother Chappelle, welcome to North Carolina in 2012. Some people keep saying this crazy stuff. You're going to have to wait and see what a Trump administration, what Trumpism decides to do. Well, we've already seen it in North Carolina. When people are backlashing and white-lashing against Reconstruction, against the possibility of people coming together, the blueprint for what it looks like to take back America in the 21st century was laid out in the extremist makeover of North Carolina's government during the 2013 legislative session. That's why some of us in here went to jail, and thousands have. What was the policy agenda? To make America great again as it worked its way out of North Carolina? Give tax breaks to corporations and the wealthy, attack public education, cut $1 billion, deny people access to health care, attack immigrants, attack the LGBT community in the name of religious liberty, strip environmental protections, roll back regulations, and finally make it easier to get a gun than it is to vote. Which is why we cannot wait and see. We've already seen enough. But just as there's been a moral movement in every era to raise a moral dissent against extremism, we have seen in North Carolina what a 21st century moral movement can look like. And if we're to have a revolution of love in the face of this modern day reaction, this attempt to cut off the possibility of reconstruction in an adolescent stage to grow into full maturity, we must heed the wisdom of history. I, along with Dr. Forbes and Sister Simone and Tracy Blackman, spent 8 months traveling to 22 states talking about a revolution of moral values, and thousands of people, thousands, showed up. I believe the people are ready. But what does a revolution look like? What would it look like? First, we must recognize the need for indigenously led, state-based, state government-focused, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative movement building. There's no shortcut around this. We must build a movement from the bottom up. We must build relationships, deep relationships, at the state level, because that's where most extremism of the current day deconstructioning is happening. We must go like in North Carolina. I have to go to the mountains of North Carolina where there are great paramilitary groups, but still not give up on the people there, as well as going to the Black Belt down in eastern North Carolina, because we need this third reconstruction. And that's why some people know it's possible. That's why they're working so hard to strangle it in the cradle. And we have to recognize this, that helicopter leadership by so-called national leaders will not sustain a moral movement. What we need are local movements. The nation, America, never changed from Washington, D.C. down. History teaches us it changes from Selma up, from Birmingham up, from Greensboro up. Secondly, we need to use moral language like the devotees of the first and second Reconstruction. Moral language can reframe and critique public policy regardless of who's in power. A moral movement claims higher ground than merely a partisan debate, something that's bigger than left versus right. I wish all of us in here tonight would make a commitment never to use left versus right again. Doesn't even make sense. It was born in the 17th century, when the left didn't want the monarchy and the right did. It doesn't even fit. And surely we need to stop talking about conservative and liberal, because really you ought to be both. You ought to want conserved justice, and you ought to want to liberally spread it to everybody. We need moral language. Stop allowing people to pigeonhole you. Listen to how Coretta Scott King used moral language. This is a cue. She said, somebody asked her, what do you think about violence since your husband was shot and murdered? She says, well, violence is much deeper than just the assassination of my husband, as ugly as that was. She says, poverty is a form of violence. Starving a child is a form of violence. Suppressing a culture is a form of violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Discrimination against working people and not giving them labor rights and health care is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. And even a lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. We will have to begin to reframe the conversation and not talk about left policies versus right policies, but let's talk about violence. And let's ask people who want our votes, are you on the side of violence? That's a real political question. You're on the side of hate. MIT economist Otto Schwammer says attention violence is one of the greatest forms of violence that we engage in public policy today, especially toward the poor. We've got to help those who want to be progressive leaders understand that it is not a loving thing to say you are simply working for those aspiring to get to the middle class. If you can't say the name poor, then don't tell me you love me. Huh? Don't tell me, because Jesus said, when I was hungry, did you feed me? We need to return or maybe for the first time bring in a deep way our public discourse to our deepest moral and constitutional values so that it doesn't matter who's in power. Some things are not about left and right, but about what's right and what's wrong. Let us take back the language. Maybe we need a modern day political Pentecost. Maybe that's the only way we can have a revolution there of love. We must hear, as that's what happened on Pentecost, afresh, and we must speak a new language. Why? For instance, why do we allow extremists to say welfare is a bad word? Why do we ever allow them to get away with making us not even use the word welfare when it's in the Constitution? Promoting the general welfare. Huh? Why is it? Why is it that we allow them to make us call people right that we believe are so wrong? J. Cameron Carter and you used to be your colleague at Duke, said language is either a tool of liberation or domination. Go read his book on race, where he talks about when people used to take over countries, the first thing they did would be to change the language and make the language of the oppressor the official language of the land, thereby rendering all other language second class. You cannot use the language of a hateful reactionary empire and build a revolution of love. Moral language gives us new metaphor. I can say I'm not against this policy because it's a conservative policy or liberal policy. I'm against it because it's constitutionally inconsistent, it's morally indefensible, and it's economically insane. And then thirdly, we have to challenge the moral hypocrisy of the so-called religious right, which we should not even be calling religious right, because they are engaging in a form of theological malpractice and religious heresy. Even the name white evangelicalism is heresy. Ain't no such thing as white evangel. What is that? As Jim Wallace says, where white evangelicalism becomes a euphemism for angry white men who just want to think Jesus is like Michelangelo drew him, and he's on the side of their guns and their hate. And there are a lot of people starting to back away from it. I recently got a call from Liberty University. Oh yeah, I told you we've been preaching revival. And when you preach, you got to believe your word is gonna become flesh. Otherwise, you ought not be preaching. Right in the middle of the revival, students from Liberty University said, will you come here next year? Will you come here next year? Because we're finding out something wrong. See, I don't know about you, but theologically, I'm an evangelical, conservative, liberal, liberationist, charismatic biblicist. All that means is what my grandmama said. I know Jesus for myself. And I know that the greatest sins in the Bible are idolatry and injustice. Idolatry, you refuse to love God. You love yourself more than you love God. Injustice, you do not love your neighbor as God has told you to love him. And you all know there are more than 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that deal with the issue of injustice toward women, the stranger, the poor, the sick, the hurting, the unacceptable. That's why the only Bible I carry now is the Poverty and Justice Bible, the one that has all the scriptures marked in it. The one that they took and cut all the pages out, and then the Bible just fell apart. They cut every page, every scripture in the Bible out that had to do with poverty, justice, and love, and the Bible literally fell apart. You know those scriptures, like Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their right and make women and children their prey. You know, that great text when Jesus opened, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath anointed me to preach good news to the patokos, the poor, one of the three words that was used for poor. But he chose the one that had to do with the poor who have been made poor by systems of economic exploitation. Can you imagine how that sounded to the empire? When Jesus dared to put the poor at the center of God's attention and then demand that they be at the center of the empire's attention, or the empire would be under the threat of an intervention by God? Huh? Can you imagine how that sounded to the people in the ghetto? That's where he was, the ghetto, Nazareth. Good news to the poor. What you talking about, Jesus? Huh? Yeah. That's very political. You've got 2,000 scriptures. How to treat people, how to treat the stranger, how to treat women, how to treat children, how to treat the poor. You might have 3 on homosexuality. And none of them trump this scripture. You still got to love your neighbor as yourself. Huh? We need to use moral language. We cannot yield the moral high ground simply because we're angry. We cannot walk away. Deep religious and moral values have been at the backbone of every great progressive movement. Prophetic imagination must come before prophetic implementation, as Brueggemann says. Remember, what would Jesus do was not a cute band to be worn on your wrist. That was a question raised in the late 1800s as a social gospel critique. What would Jesus do in the face of children without child labor laws, and men dying without labor rights, and people living in slums and poverty without minimum wage? What would Jesus do? And that began the social gospel movement, and there would be no labor movement without the social gospel movement. There'd be no abolition movement without William Lloyd Garrison and other people who kept. There would have been, Teddy Roosevelt would have never suggested that all Americans ought to have health care in 1912 in his bull speech if it hadn't been for what was happening in the pulpits in America, in the social gospel movement. There would have never been a New Deal if you didn't have Frances Berry, who was a woman social gospelist, who was whispering in the ear of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There would have never been a civil rights movement without the moral framework underneath it. There would have never been a critique of poverty, unchecked capitalism, labor rights, health care, criminal justice reform, climate change. None of this without a deep moral underpinning. And we must not forget that the politics of hate always hires false prophets. And the real prophets cannot stay stuck in their classrooms. And our seminaries cannot merely train managers, because there's always somebody trying to hijack religious language. It was the religious leaders who said, crucify him. It was the redemption preachers, the so-called redemption, who attacked the political religionism of ministers who were preaching love in the public square. And today it's preachers like Franklin Graham who are trumpeting hate in God's name. Following the election of Donald Trump, Graham said political pundits are stunned. Many thought Trump-Pence ticket didn't have a chance. None of them understand the God factor. While the media scratches their head, he said, I believe God's hand intervened. No, God's hand didn't intervene, but Billy Graham Evangelistic Association did. Graham spent $10 million of his daddy's organization going around rallying hate in the public square. And where does that trace all the way back? Listen to what Kevin Cruz says in his book, One Nation Under God. It traces back to the business leaders who hated the New Deal, but did not have the credibility to speak to the nation, so they outsourced the job. They hired a preacher to go around and buy Christian pulpits. They put money behind them. Sun Oil, General Motors, the National Chamber of Commerce, the National Manufacturing. And within about 10 years, they had 19,000 pulpits that they had bought. They taught a perverted brand of Calvinism. If you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. If you're good, you have money. If you're bad, you're poor. That's where this stuff comes from. And we need a moral agenda. We need a moral agenda. We need an agenda that can call people to another place. We need an agenda that says, finally, we want to secure pro-labor, anti-poverty policies, anti-racist policies that ensure economic sustainability. We want to fight for full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones. That's what love looks like in the public square. Strong safety nets for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, infrastructure development, and ceasing war baiting and extreme militarism. And we want fair tax reform. Then we want educational equality. Every child should receive a high quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education and access to college. That's not Bernie's agenda, that's Jesus' agenda. Suffer the little children and let them come. We should want everybody to have health care. Everybody. Why? Because the progressives said it? No, because when Jesus came, everywhere he went, he set up free health clinics. And that even started in the Old Testament, well, long before you got to the New Testament. Social Security, protecting women's health, environmental justice. Why we want environmental justice? Because it's a Democrat? No, because in Genesis 1, we were given dominion. That is to take care of, am I right? Not to destroy. And we want fairness in the criminal justice system, because what did Amos say? You got to deal with those who want corruption in the courts, in the public square. We want to deal with the inequalities not only that affect black people, but brown people and poor white people. We want to stop the proliferation of guns, because we know hate only builds hate. And if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And then we want equal protection under the law. Why? Because it's a constitution. Well, that's one reason. But it's also God's principle. He lets the light and the rain shine and rain on the just and the unjust. He's an equal opportunity God. You know, he protects everybody. So we want to protect voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, Muslims, immigrants. We want to protect the original citizens in Standing Rock. We will never give up on the principle of equal protection under the law. A moral agenda. And then in this agenda, We want to bring everyday people to the fore, not just numbers, but we want to build platforms all over this country that brings everyday people that are hurt by extremism so that folks' hearts are moved and their consciousness are moved. Because you want a revolutionary love, you got to make people cry. You got to make them weep and wail. And so you want to bring, like the mother down in Birmingham, Alabama, who testified at one of our revivals. Her daughter died in her arms from blood clots because Alabama refused to expand Medicaid simply because they hate a black man in a White House. And when she told that story, it moved the hearts of people. And then we got to recognize the centrality of race. You're not going to deal with this America until you deal with the demon of race and class together. You got to ask that same question that Jesus asked when that little boy was rolling around. Jesus had just come from the Mount of Transfiguration. One of the texts that makes me so mad, because I'd be like, hurry up, Jesus, the boy over there rolling around. But Jesus understood sometimes you got to do a diagnosis. I'm like, hurry up, Jesus, cuss your disciples out and get on over there and heal the man. But he asked the daddy, how long had the boy been like this? And when he told him that it was from the beginning. From the beginning, America has wrestled with race and class. From the beginning, America has wrestled with race and class. So Jesus said, oh, this boy ain't just deaf, he's dumb too. He can't hear, nor can he speak. America can't hear. That's why she speaks wrong or doesn't speak at all. That's why she's muted on the issues of race and class. And if we're going to deal with this kind of demon, this comes out only through fasting and prayer. In other words, you got to be willing to meet it hard and straight up, as they say in the street. If you don't understand racism, you don't understand what's going on when you call a president a food stamp president, a juvenile, a socialist, a lie. And then you got to understand racism. And my good white brothers, sisters, we got to have y'all talk about this, not just black people. Racism ain't about no prejudice. You know, racism ain't about prejudice. Racism about policy. I said that to Miss Clinton when she was running. I said, get off that David Duke stuff. That's not where you want to talk about racism in America. Let's talk about policies. Talk about policy. That's a trick talking about David. We already know he kind of crazy. That's all right. The racist I'm worried about is not David Duke with his loudness. It's Paul Ryan with his quietness. Y'all don't want to mess with me. That's the racism I'm worried about. The racism I'm worried about is a Congress that for over 1,200 days refuses to fix the Voting Rights Act. That's oh God, that's 1,100 and some odd days longer than Strom Thurmond filibustered the Civil Rights Act of '57, and you're doing that with parliamentary procedures and a smile. But that's racism, and we got to have this grown-up conversation. You all got to help this, preachers. We got to profess this grown-up conversation about and do a diagnostic exam on the vestiges of the Southern strategy when it comes to race and class. See, here's the question. Here's the question. We got to help America deal with, like Jesus said that. But how long you been like this? What is it that causes many whites that are poor? Since the census say there are 18.9 million whites that are poor and 8 million more poor whites than there are black and 5 million more poor whites than there are Latino, what causes many whites, particularly out in the South and the Rust Belt and sometimes in areas of the North, to be against programs like food stamps, Medicaid, when mostly whites are using them? What causes you to be against living wages? I'm not mad, just we got to raise that question. When 400 families make an average of $97,000 an hour while we're locking people up who are fighting for 15, what causes you to elect politicians that represent the poorest counties in the north, south, east, and west of this country who vote against the programs that would help the poor, like living wages and labor rights? What trumps common sense? What mythology? What mythology is so powerful? What mythology? What mythology? What makes you stand against health care that will actually help more whites than black? In North Carolina, 500,000 people would have been helped with Medicaid expansion, 30,000 veterans, 346,000 of them are white. And yet the majority of the people saying they're against Medicaid expansion are white. What myth makes you think that supporting resegregated high-poverty schools is going to help you? What makes you think that privatizing schools with public money is going to allow your poor child to go when they couldn't afford it even with the scholarship from the government? Yeah. What is it that makes you against voting rights? Don't you know voting rights is not just about black people? Voting rights is an attack on women. It's an attack on public education. It's an attack on labor rights. It's an attack on every progressive policy. Because when you undermine the ability for the democracy to have its full voting power, you allow extremism to rule. And so We need a revolution of love. We got to break this one movement, one moment mentality. And we got to come together and understand the same people fighting the LGBTQ queer community are the same people fighting voting rights. And the same people fighting voting rights are the same people fighting living wages. And the same people fighting living wages are fighting environmentalists. And the same people fighting are fighting healthcare expansion. And many of the people that are following them, if they could just see a little love, they would understand they're simply being used by a hateful oligarchy that plays us against one another so that they can hold on. And so in South Africa, you know what they said after bad elections like the one we just had? They would look at that thing sometime and they say, you know, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. See, love will make you see things like that. Love will make you go to the cross knowing you got a resurrection on the other side. So you endure some things for that you know is beyond. Could it be really that the election of Donald Trump may be the last gasp of the Southern strategy? I tell you, it's time to hold on just a little bit longer. They wouldn't be fighting us this hard if they weren't afraid that love is on the rise. And so, my friends, it's time. It's time. It's time to believe that the wealthy can pay their fair share, that we can have a living wage, that we can stop giving socialism to corporation, that we can fund our schools, that we can address the ugly realities of racism, that we can sing God shed his grace on us and then give grace to immigrants and grace to the LGBT community. We have to believe that it is possible. But we got to keep working. My son, as I close, is an environmental physicist. And every now and then he tells me, you know, physicists are kind of crazy. And they're like biblical people who have PhDs in biblical studies. They got all that stuff up in their head, you know, all that Aramaic and Hebrew and German and French, you know. And that's how physicists are. They look at things from like that. So not long again, he told me, he says, Daddy, if you ever find yourself stranded out in the mountainous territory and you got to walk out, he said, Daddy, don't walk through the valley. I said, son, what are you talking about? He said, look, Daddy, let me tell you something. I'm an environmental physicist. Snakes live in the valley. He said, now it might cost you a little energy, but it's better to walk up the mountain and walk out across the mountain than it is to walk through the valley. I said, why? He said, because every biologist knows, Daddy, that there's something called a snake line. He said, snakes are cold-blooded animals. All they know to do is just strike. They're just full of strike and fear and hate. But they can't live at high altitude. And he said, Daddy, if you get above the snake line, you can make it out without being bit. He said, it might be hard to get up there, but if you get above the snake line, the snakes can't destroy you. Well, I stopped by to tell you, it's our time, preachers and religious scholars, to get America above the snake line. Lord have mercy. We need you. We need the American Academy of Religion. That's what religion was doing when it stood against slavery. It said slavery was below the snake line. And today, folk are enslaved. We need to say hate is below the snake line. To those enslaved by racism is below the snake line. Homophobia, xenophobia is below the snake line. Greed is below the snake line. Injustice is below the snake line. Just wanting power for power's sake is below the snake line. But it's time for us to raise a moral standard above the snake line, a revolution of love. And if we can get above the snake line, I declare the sick will have adequate health care. If we can get above the snake line, the environment will be protected. If we can get above the snake line, we can change our criminal justice system. But we got to climb. We got to climb. We can't settle for fighting and bickering and anger and distortion. We got to get a little higher. If we get above the snake line, we can reject hate and division and mean attempts to write people out of the Constitution because of their race, their creed, or their sexual orientation. If we get above the snake line, we can see all people as God's creation and members of the human family. If we get above the snake line, our politics can be moral, our language can be moral, our way forward can be moral. If we get above the snake line, a nation of immigrants can be welcome and welcoming to everybody. I tell you tonight, I don't care what happened last week. I know something. Justice is above the snake line. Love is above the snake line. Mercy is above the snake line. I'm not going to engage in the politics of the snake. I'm not going to stay down here where that election wants us to stay. I'm on my way above the snake line. And my prayers for you is that we'll refuse to live below the snake line. We'll make this reconstruction, this revolution of love real, but y'all got to come back into the public square. You got to be willing to be accused, as your forebears were, of political religionism. And if you believe there's life above the snake line, we need you, Auburn. We need you, Yale. We need you, Princeton. We need you, Union. We need you, Wake Forest. We need you back in the public square. It might get hard, but we need you back there. That's why on this year, December 31st, at 10 o'clock, we're going to have a national watch night service. I'll call Bishop Curry. If any of y'all know him, tell him I'm looking for him. We want to have it at the National Cathedral. I just finished talking to Joanne Baez. She said she's willing to get back to work. And we're going to call and live stream it all over the country. And you know, in 1862, black folk had watch night services because they were waiting for the clock to strike 12:01, January 1st, 1963, so they could enlist in the fight against bigotry and slavery. They knew January 1st, 1963 wasn't going to be the end of the war, but they knew they would have the freedom to get involved. I believe we need to say something December 31st of this year. We need to announce that we're going to revive the Poor People's Campaign. We need to announce not just a memory, not a commemoration, but the actual campaign. That we as people of faith are going to reclaim the moral agenda. That we might be facing some hard times, but we're not going to fall back. We're going to fall in. And we're going to enlist, and we're going to begin to help in our words and our deeds take this nation above the snake line. Now, I'm going to level with you tonight. It ain't always easy to meet hate with love. I'm not just telling you something I read in the good book. No, this hate put a gun to my daddy's face. Told him that if he didn't get out of Georgia in the 1950s, he wouldn't live to see another day. This hate, I don't talk about it often, has spewed across my cell phone and the internet, threatening to cut me down. Told me 2 years ago you'd never make it to Christmas if I didn't sit down and shut up. No, it's not easy to get above the snake line, but Jesus didn't command us to love one another when things were easy. Jesus didn't say that. He said it knowing he was headed toward the cross. He said it right in the middle of strong men on the throne. He said it when he knew that he would have a cross, which is always the first stop on revolutionary love, but he also said it believing in the resurrection. How then do you keep climbing above the snake line when you face hate and backlash? How do you press on? Well, sometimes if you're going to climb above the snake line, you better be a good singer. And you have to start singing, love lifted me. Love lifted me when nothing else would help. Love lifted me. When I want to hate the people that tell me they're going to kill me, love lifted me. When I want to give up, love lifted me. And is there anybody in here still believe love has lifting power? Well, it's our time. It's our time for revolutionary love. And love is the only way to get there. So I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights. I'm reaching every day, still praying as I'm homeward bound. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. Lord, lift us to higher ground. Lord, lift this nation to higher ground. Lord, give us the power of love to lift our Congress and lift our presidency and lift our churches and lift our seminaries and lift our communities, even if it costs us. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. Hallelujah!
Lord, lift us up and let us stand by faith on heaven, tableland, a higher plane that I have found. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. Lord, lift us up and let us stand by faith on heaven, tableland, a higher plane that I have found. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. Lord, plant our feet. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground.
I want you to know that Union and Auburn Seminary and Union Theological Seminary and Healing of the Nation and Drum Major Instinct, Repairs of the Breach, and Kairos Center with Liz Theo Harris and others have joined in this call for this National Watch Night service. Before we go into the new year, a commitment that we're not giving up, turning back. If anything, we're going to press forward into the kind of agenda that must transform. So, if there are any other, if you check out Repairers of the Breach website, this is not about anybody trying to be the leader. In fact, the goal of this is to live stream those watch nights, that service all over the country so people can build up in states all over the country. And we can enlist ourselves with the imagination of revolutionary love, because before implementation, our imagination has to be right. I've been a little sick today with this flu. All of us been sick in the last couple with these colds, so I won't be sneezing on y'all too much. But thank you all so much for everything you do, for every student you train, for every person that you move, for the academies that give us the kind of critique and analysis that enables us to meander our way and walk through this rugged terrain of race and class. And my only plea with all of us is, and I'm one of you, I'm in the academy too, but let's make sure that the academy alone is not our home. It may come a day that the Academy of Religion has to decide to have your conference on the lawn of the White House. And if they arrest us, they arrest us. But like Ezekiel, we live in the midst of a people who are stiff-necked. But God said, let them hear you, because at least they'll know there hath been a prophet among them. God bless you.